Good afternoon and welcome to this afternoon's webinar. Our presenter for today is Penny Potamatopoulos, who works at the University of Wollongong College in New South Wales, otherwise known as UOW College. She teaches EAP direct entry courses there. In 2017, Penny was part of the English Australia Action Research in ELICOS program, where she undertook a project about teaching pronunciation and the effect that it has on students' listening skills. Since then, she's continued her work in this area, and this year she presented a similar session to today's at the IATEFL conference in the UK. So thank you for coming along and presenting, Penny.
My pleasure. Thank you very much, Sophie. And thanks everyone out there in webinar land listening to this webinar. So listening, are we teaching our students how to listen, or are we testing their listening? Are we giving them strategies to help them learn to listen better, or are we just giving them lots of listening practice? Are we giving them endless comprehension activities without really helping them learn how to listen better? What do we advise our students when they ask us, how can I improve my listening? Just think about these questions. I suspect that many of us are giving our students lots of listening practice and then testing them on it with pre-listening questions and post-listening questions and marking comprehension questions right and wrong. And we advise our students to listen to BTN, listen and read the text, or watch a TED Talk and listen and read the text. And these are all great activities and we should keep doing them. But how far do they actually go towards helping our students learn how to listen? I first became interested in this aspect of teaching listening, the how to listen, because of my long-standing interest in teaching pronunciation skills. And so I went online to find some wonderful activities that someone else had already prepared to use in the classroom, and I could hardly find anything. I could find plenty on how to use a listening in class, how to exploit the listening, what activities could be done for students. But I was interested in helping students gain some skills and strategies when they were not in the classroom, when they didn't have the teacher to guide them or the activities to guide them. And so, as Sophie mentioned, in 2017, I, with a colleague, Sian Hammond, undertook an action research project in which we investigated this question: how does raising students' awareness of stress, intonation and pausing, or SIP, affect students' listening skills? So what is SIP and why is it important? Well, to answer those two questions, we're going to do a little activity first. So listen to what I'm saying and tell me, according to what you hear, who is speaking. Okay. John said, the teacher was really easy to understand. I'll say it again. John said, the teacher was really easy to understand. Okay, so who's talking? Yes, you're right, it's John. Let's have a look at that. Oh, something's gone wrong with my slide. Not getting my slide.
No, if you just go down to the corner, can you see the icons?
Oh, yeah, it's like I can't see them.
That's okay. If you click enter now, it should change, I think.
Oh.
Or just, yeah, there we go.
Oh, sorry. Okay. I'll click again.
Yep. Great.
Okay. So if we were to read that sentence, John said the teacher was really easy to understand, we'd have the punctuation to guide our understanding. But if we just hear it, we don't have anything except the SIP, which looks like this. John said, the teacher was really easy to understand. Okay, so I'm going to do it again, the same sentence, but with different SIP. So listen and tell me who is speaking. John, said the teacher, was really easy to understand. I'll say it again. John, said the teacher, was really easy to understand. So again, if we were to read that sentence, we'd have the benefit of the punctuation to guide our meaning. But if we hear it, we can't see punctuation, we only hear SIP. And it sounds like this. John, said the teacher, was really easy to understand. All right, let's do it one more time. Listen again and tell me this time who's speaking. John said the teacher was really easy to understand. Okay, this time it would look like this if it were written. But if we were to hear it and we couldn't see the punctuation, we'd be guided by the SIP. Whoops. And it's not coming up. Anyway, so
There we go.
There we go. Okay, so we could say that SIP is to listening as punctuation is to reading. There we go, okay. So, so SIP is to listening as punctuation is to reading. So is anybody doing much of this with their students? If you are, that's wonderful, keep doing it. If you're not, you should be. Why? Because our research clearly showed that the students benefit greatly from having their awareness of SIP raised. We found that the students' confidence in listening really improved, and their assessment of their own listening skills also improved. They had begun the project assessing themselves as fairly poor listeners, and then they finished off assessing themselves as good or very good listeners in some cases. And the slides are getting ahead of me, but these are some of the students' comments that they made at the end of the project about becoming more aware of SIP. I can have enough time to thinking, and when speaker is pausing, I know the sentence is finished. You can understand when someone moves to other point, keywords and details. It's so useful for listening. And I have another slide with some more comments. One sentence can have different meaning. It's not just about knowing the vocab. Intonation can help you with meaning, and so you become a good listener. And finally, when I learnt SIP, it gives me time to understand better than before. I didn't know SIP before, it helps me. So that's what SIP is, and that's why it's important. But how do we actually help our students become more aware of this and start to use it as a strategy in their listening? Well, I'm going to explain and demonstrate 3 activities that we did as part of our research project. And these are 3 that we found the students enjoyed and really benefited from. And I think with any pronunciation activities like this, it's best to do a little bit regularly. So this first activity focuses on just establishing the concept of SIP with the students. So you can do it in 3 sessions. So first they listen and mark on a piece of text, they mark the pausing. Then in another session they would listen and mark the stress. And then in the final session they would listen and mark the intonation. So you could do this in 3 separate lessons, or as the students become more familiar with it, you might do it all in one lesson. So the first thing is to choose a piece of text, listening text that the students have already used in class. Just choose about 20 seconds of text and choose one that's got a reasonably clear amount of stress, intonation and pausing. So the first step is to just play the recording for the students to listen to. So we're going to listen to 20 seconds or so of a guy talking about the purpose of pausing. So thanks, Sophie.
Okay.
In its simplest form, pausing is used to give the speaker time to breathe. Used well, pausing can help focus the listener's attention on important information. Pauses can be used to emphasize new or important vocabulary.
Okay, so the next step would be to give the students a copy of the text, which is there, and then play it again and ask them this time to listen and to put a / where they hear the speaker pause. So let's do that together. Sophie, can we have it again, please?
In its simplest form, pausing is used to give the speaker time to breathe. Used well, pausing can help focus the listener's attention on important information. Pauses can be used to emphasize new or important vocabulary.
Okay, so how did you go? So in my class, the next step would be to invite a couple of students up to the front of the class where I've got the text on the board or projected on the board, and they would mark the pauses that they heard. And they can negotiate with the class to come to some sort of agreement. And their text might look something like this. So once they've come to an agreement with the rest of the class, I would play it again just to check. Then I read it aloud with them just to help them focus on the fact that they've heard the pauses. And then I ask them to get into pairs and read it to each other and listen and think about how hearing the pausing helps their listening. And we'll just go back to a couple of the students' comments that they made about the benefit of hearing SIP. So one student had said, I can have enough time to thinking, and when speaker is pausing, I know the sentence is finished. And secondly, you can understand when someone moves to other point, keywords and details. It's so useful for listening. So that's how the students reacted to focusing on pausing. So that might be the end of your first session, and then the following day or a later class, you could do it again and focus this time on hearing the stress. So we're going to do that together as well, just to give you some practice. So again, the students already have their paper with the pausing marked. And this time they use the same piece of paper, but they listen just for the stress. So Sophie, could we have the text, the audio again, please?
Sure.
In its simplest form, pausing is used to give the speaker time to breathe. Used well, pausing can help focus the listener's attention on important information. Pauses can be used to emphasize new or important vocabulary.
Okay, so I should have said that normally when I ask them to mark the stress, I pause the audio where the speaker pauses, just to give them time. But we didn't do that with you. So again, I'd invite students up the front to mark the stress, negotiate with the class, come to some agreement, and they may have something that looks a bit like this. Then I would play it again to just check that everyone agrees. We'd read it aloud together, and then in pairs, again, the students would read it to each other and think about how hearing the stress helps their listening. And let's go back to one of the students' comments. The students felt, I can hear new words and have more focus on them and hear fast speech better with this skill. So I thought that was quite interesting, that notion of hearing fast speech better. So let's do it one last time. And this time we're going to listen and mark the intonation, but that can be a little more tricky, both hearing the intonation and actually drawing the squiggles. It is a bit of a challenge for students and also for teachers, I find, but something rough is fine. And if you're not really clear about hearing it, I find it's quite useful to hum. So in this case, the sentence would be read, would sound something like this. Intonation is the rise and fall of our voice when we speak. If you're not really grabbing the intonation, try humming. Something like that. Okay, so let's listen again. This time we've got the same text, so you've got the pausing marked and the stress marked. Let's listen again, Sophie, and listen for the intonation.
In its simplest form, pausing is used to give the speaker time to breathe. Used well, pausing can help focus the listener's attention on important information. Pauses can be used to emphasize new or important vocabulary.
Right, well, how did you go? So again, we'd follow the same steps. Students would come up, fiddle around with the intonation, discuss with the class. They'd end up hopefully with something that looks a little bit like this. And we play it again, read it aloud, and then they'd read it in pairs to each other. So remember the purpose of this is just to raise their awareness of the existence of stress, intonation, and pausing. So the fact, if they don't have it exactly the same way that you do, it's not such a big deal. It's really just, what are you hearing and how does it help you? So let's look again at some of their comments now. That's the end of the activity, essentially. Just want to look back at some of their comments to reinforce how helpful the students found it. And I'll just go through these a bit more quickly because we've looked at them already a couple of times. So clearly they found it very useful. And even students who already were reasonable listeners and reasonable speakers didn't have this concept and didn't have a sense of how it might help their listening. And I'll just show you finally the steps that I follow. Oh, sorry, before that. You could follow up with some discussion questions, asking the students to look at the connection between stress, intonation and pausing. And they can see clearly with the physical markings that between the pauses, something's going on. There's something special happening between pauses. There's some stress and there's some intonation. And then the second question, how does it help them to know when a sentence ends? Once they start picking up the subtleties of intonation, they can notice that there's the intonation hum, and then a definite at the end of the sentence. This is theoretical, obviously. This is if people are speaking clearly, but generally they're picking up the concepts and listening for the sound of sip. And now I'll just move on to the steps that I follow. So that's the end of activity 1. And I'm happy to take questions or comments at this point if anyone would like to throw one my way.
So if you have a question, you can just type it into the chat. All right, no questions have come through yet.
Okay,
but,
good, must have been crystal clear.
If you think of any, just type them in and we can save them up for the end.
All right, okay, so let's move on then to the second activity. This one builds on the last to some extent and focuses the students' attention on the notion of, oops, I'll just leave that there for the moment, focuses on the notion that we hear language in chunks of meaning. And now I've lost my train of thought because the slides come up too early. So we hear language in chunks, which helps the students to just navigate listening a little more easily, because they learn that they can hang on to a manageable chunk of language rather than trying to hear everything from beginning to end in the entire stream of speech. So this slide is to just remind us of what a chunk or a thought group is. So chunks are set off by pauses before and after. They contain one prominent element. They have an intonation contour of their own, and they usually have a grammatically coherent internal structure. So the students have already hopefully picked this up with the first activity, seeing what goes on between pauses, that there is stress and there is intonation contained between pauses. Okay, so I call this one jumbled thought groups. Oops, I just went forward too many. Okay, so for this activity, you need one sentence divided into thought groups. And you write it as a list. Each thought group is numbered, and then you cut up the thought group. So you've got 6 strips of paper. And I'll just try and get to that slide. Not happening.
It's okay, I'll do it for you.
Okay, thanks, Sophie. Not very good at this slide business. So you've got yes, okay. So you've got a sentence divided into 6 or whatever number you choose, thought groups, numbered 1 to 6. You cut them up into separate strips, and you give each student in the group one thought group with the number, and you ask them just to look at it and think about how they might say it. So they just see one thought group, they don't know what the whole sentence is. You also give them a piece of paper that looks like this, 6 blank lines, and you give them a dice. So the procedure is, within their group, in random order, the students throw the dice. Let's say first student throws the dice, it comes up on 3. Student with thought group number 3 reads out the number and the thought group. The other students listen and write it down. So their paper would look then like this. And so they keep going through the whole group until everyone's read their thought group and they've got the whole sentence, which looks like this. Okay. So at the end of the activity, give them a little bit of time just to read it through. They probably read it aloud with each other, and then read it together as a class. So they're focusing on noticing the pauses and hearing each other read with pauses. Then you can ask them in pairs within the group or as a group still to look at the whole sentence and decide where they should put the stress and intonation on each thought group. And they can practice reading that aloud together. And again, listen and think about how hearing the pausing helps their listening. And at this stage, you as the teacher can just be wandering around monitoring and answering questions and helping. But the idea is for them to be listening to each other. And then it's quite useful to give them a couple of follow-up questions. So you can ask them to think about why the sentence is broken into 6 lines. Well, clearly there are 6 thought groups and each one needs to have a pause at the end of it. And how easy or difficult was it to understand the speaker? Well, hopefully it was easy because they heard the pauses. And for teachers, you can think about this question: how could this activity help students learn how to listen better? All right, and here are the steps for that activity. These will be available, won't they, Sophie, the slides afterwards?
Yes.
Yeah, okay, so I won't linger on that, but this one's got 2 slides because it's got quite a few instructions. All right, so that's the end of the second activity. And I'm happy to take any questions or comments if you have them.
Okay, there's a couple of questions from the form.
Okay.
Penny, could you just turn the volume down on your computer just for the distortion?
Sure,
Yeah.
I'll just...
Great. So the first question is,
Mhm.
what level student would you begin a SIP activity with?
Oh, good question. I've done it with pre-intermediate students, but my colleague in her class did it with quite advanced students. And we realised that it didn't really matter the level of the student, because generally none of them had a concept of SIP. So I guess it's just a matter of choosing the sentence or the text to suit the level of your students rather than the activity. The activity can work with any level.
Okay.
You
Great.
may need to, I'll just add, you may need to play it more than once for a lower level of students, and you may need to guide them with humming or with clapping or with some sort of other activity just to help them to notice it. But it's not a question of language, actually. It's just a question of, I guess, of noise, isn't it? SIP is really noise, or the absence of noise. Does that help?
Okay. Yes. Someone else
Okay.
has just asked what you would describe the main difference between stress and intonation as being.
Oh gosh, I've never been asked that before. The main difference, I suppose, stress is the strength of your voice when you utter a word, and the intonation actually is an automatic. It happens automatically. You try stressing a word with no intonation, you can't do it. As soon as you stress a word, the intonation happens. So I guess the difference is stress is the strength of the sound of the word, and intonation is the rise and fall of your voice that accompanies that strength.
Yeah, I think that's a great explanation.
Yes. So, for example, if you're reading out a list of things, say 3 or 4 things, like I like coffee, tea, chocolate, and cake, we would say I like coffee, tea, chocolate, and cake. So we're emphasizing, we're stressing the word coffee sounds strong, and at the same time, because I haven't finished the sentence, the intonation is rising. So that, I guess the difference is the function to some extent, that the intonation gives a different indication, in that case that I haven't finished, and in the case of the end of the sentence, it indicates I have finished. Does that help?
Okay. It definitely helps.
Good, okay.
Someone's just made a comment here, which is pretty useful. They're talking about the notes on iPhone and how it has the facility to record a voice message and then it will turn it into text. And if students use it, they have to be pronouncing reasonably well for the correct text to appear. So it's a great way to practice pronunciation. And it's funny that you should mention that, the person who did mention that from the audience, because this year the Action Research Program for English Australia is on pronunciation, and one of the researchers is using the iPhone notes as part of their project.
Oh, that's fantastic. So you possibly get some very funny recordings, like you do with predictive text when you're typing a text message.
Absolutely.
Yeah, okay. Oh, that sounds fantastic. All right, are there any more questions before we move on to the...
now.
Great, okay. All right, so the last activity is my favourite. It's the most fun, I think. So we've come from establishing the concept of SIP and listening specifically for SIP in 3 separate sessions, to listening for how SIP helps us hear chunks of language. And then this final activity focuses on hearing the way when SIP is applied, how a whole utterance is given meaning, and how by changing the SIP or getting the SIP wrong or altering the SIP in some way, the meaning is completely different. So you can have a total nonsensical utterance, or you can have it mean one thing or another. So it's kind of bringing all the bits together in this last activity. I call this one John Said because it's the same principle as the John Said practice activity we did back at the start of the webinar. So we'll begin by me telling you something. I want you to listen and tell me, according to what I say, what do I love? Okay. I love cooking my family and my dog. I'll say it again. I love cooking my family and my dog. So the students hear this and they say, oh, you love cooking for your family? No, I didn't say that. Oh, you love cooking with your family? No, I didn't say that. Oh, and then tick, 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 tick. They go, oh, you love 3 things. And I say, well, do I? Did I say that? What did I say? How do you know I love 3 things? And so we discuss it and they laugh. And finally, I elicit a better way to say it. And hopefully they tell me that I should have said, I love cooking, my family, and my dog. Yes, I do. And so I would write that on the board, and I would either invite the students or I would mark the stress, intonation, and pausing, and we'd have a little laugh and get started on the rest of the activity. So the rest of the activity is to give the students a number of sentences with no punctuation and ask them, you can either give them the sentences to think about in pairs, and they can work out, they can have different sentences, and they can work out how they would say it to each other. Then when they're ready, they just say it to each other, listen and decide what message they're getting according to the SIP. And it's really quite interesting because sometimes the message the speaker wants to give is not the message the listener gets. So there's a lot of negotiation that goes on where they try and kind of pin down what exactly they're trying to say and how they can best say it so that the message is delivered clearly. So I'm going to give you the sentences, and the other way you could do it is just to read them to the students, which is what I'm going to do now. So here's the first sentence. Listen and tell me, what am I saying? We're going out to eat, kids. We're going out to eat, kids. We're going out to eat, kids. I think that's probably the best option. That'll be up in a minute, hopefully. Sophie, help me. Oh, sorry, I should have said, I should have said, while you listen to these sentences, think about these questions.
Hold on, I'll just go back for you, Penny.
The John Said one is where I'm up to. Okay, sorry, I'm really sorry about that. So as you're listening, think about how can SIP be added to provide meaning to these statements, and how does the meaning change according to the SIP? So there we are, back to the first one. We're going out to eat, kids. So clearly we're not going to eat our children or anyone else's children. We're going out to eat, kids. Going out to eat. Yeah. So there's a pause before kids, and there's a fall rise intonation on eat. Oh, that's what I would say anyway. All right, listen to the next one. I'm going to visit my parents, the King and the Queen. I'll say it again. I'm going to visit my parents, the King and the Queen. So am I visiting 4 people or am I visiting 2 people? I'm going to visit my parents, the King and the Queen. Or I'm going to visit my parents, the King and the Queen. So I have a very busy day ahead. Okay, so here's that second sentence. And finally, this is my favourite. So listen to this. What am I actually saying? Woman without her man is nothing. I'll say it again. Woman without her man is nothing. Well, that's not true, is it? What am I saying? Woman without her man is nothing. Well, clearly no. Or woman without her man is nothing. I think that's really what I'm saying, kind of. So that one's there somewhere, but hasn't shown up yet. Okay. Oh, thank you. Okay, so those are kind of fun ones you can use to start with. And then I sometimes just pick fairly ordinary sentences that the students are more likely to hear. This is the first one. What is the first one? Sorry. Okay. They went for a walk because they were tired. They didn't walk far. They went for a walk because they were tired. They didn't walk far. They went for a walk because they were tired. They didn't walk far. Or they went for a walk because they were tired. They didn't walk far, which is probably more likely the case. And that's going to come up in a minute, I hope. And the other one, there's one more. You can go home early. The other students can't go and get some sleep. Sorry. It's very hard to say a sentence without stress or intonation or pausing. You can go home early. The other students can't go and get some sleep. You can go home early. The other students can't. Go and get some sleep. That's what I'm trying to say. There we are. Okay. So you can have a lot of fun with that one. You can use all sorts of sentences. It's a little bit like reading a text with no punctuation, except just you're hearing it, you're not reading it. So here's a question to leave you with before we take some more questions. How could you use these activities in your classroom to help students learn how to listen better? And some references I found really helpful, both in the Action Research project and also just for general reading about this area of listening and pronunciation. Particularly Caldwell and Celsi Mosier I found to be really useful. And here's a lovely quote that came from Richard Caldwell. We teachers have developed a way of kidding ourselves we're teaching listening when we aren't. Ain't that the truth? So that's the end of the activities. If anyone has any more questions or comments, it would be really good to have some discussion going.
Oh, somebody's asking if you could share the questionnaire you used with the students to assess their confidence levels before the SIP lessons and after.
Okay. It was very simple because the students were fairly low level. We just used a sliding scale, I guess you'd call it. We had, at one end, we had the question, how do you feel, or how would you assess your listening skill? At one end, we had very poor, and then we moved up a notch to quite poor, then good, quite good, and very good. So they just put a little cross on the line where they thought their listening was. So they didn't actually have to use their own words to describe it.
Great.
And just on that assessment, we wanted to move away from measuring their listening skills with listening comprehension tests, because you know what it's like doing a test. Even people who are quite good at something don't always do well on a test. So that was it was interesting to observe that the students who did feel their listening was improving weren't necessarily getting better scores on their tests, which is actually it's a whole nother issue, isn't it? But the important thing was that their confidence increased. So you know how students tend to just switch off if they think they're not going to understand, or if they think the listening text is too long, they just virtually stop listening. We found that they were better at not stopping listening. And especially when they could understand the chunking idea, that they felt if they'd missed something, they would wait for a pause and then start listening again. So it kind of gave them a breather, and they kind of stopped fretting about the fact that they'd missed something, because they knew they could start listening again where there was a little bit of an inroad. Does that make sense? Yep. Okay.
Absolutely. And I think the fact that you have all these insights into how your students found the learning process is a really good example of how action research helps us to understand better what's happening in our classrooms.
Yeah, absolutely.
All right. Well, that's it for the questions. Some people are asking about the recording. The link for the recording and the slides will be emailed to people tomorrow. Sorry, I said that too early because a few more questions have just come through to me.
Okay, cool.
We do have a few minutes. Are you okay to answer them, Penny?
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay, great. Someone's written a comment, and it's probably true as well. They've said, I am thinking that paying attention to SIP in listening probably supports students' ability to comprehend written text as well. Do you agree?
Oh, do you mean in terms of noticing punctuation?
I guess maybe they're talking about chunking and things like that.
Okay, so written text, understanding a written text is based on their reading ability. I suppose yes, if they're paying attention to punctuation, that's the only way I think it could be considered to be similar.
And I guess just building an awareness of chunking as well with phrase
absolutely,
chunking.
yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, I hadn't thought about that. That's an interesting one. Okay.
Someone else has said that good readers, sorry, as a follow-up to the writing and the reading and intonation comment, the same person has said that good readers read aloud in their heads using pause and silent intonation. Interesting.
Yes, it would be really interesting to do a follow-up project on how the students move from the hearing stage to the speaking stage, because I think that takes a lot longer for them to actually adopt it in their speaking.
Yeah, absolutely. Someone's just asked if you give the students the text with the punctuation afterwards so that they can use it later to read better.
I often ask them to put the punctuation in themselves. So yeah, you can actually do that if you do a dictation or a dictogloss or something like that. I sometimes do a dictation and I don't give them the commas and full stops. And once they finish writing, I read it again, and then, or as they're doing it, they listen for the intonation and the pauses to help them work out where to put the punctuation. So yeah, that's a good exercise actually.
Yeah. Okay, great. There's a lot of comments coming through. Someone's doing something similar, a project at Monash College as well. But one of the comments I'd like to relay is that one of the attendees really likes the idea of just doing short, sharp bursts of pronunciation and integrating them into other lessons so that we don't overload students, but that they're
Yes.
learning incrementally.
Yes, absolutely. I think you can exploit a reading or a listening text in so many different ways without introducing lots and lots of new material. Take what you've got and exploit it as much as you can.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, absolutely. And you said it should be a text that's already been covered in class so that the
Yes. Yeah.
context is very familiar.
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay, wonderful. Well, Penny, I'd just like to say thank you. You've given us a really clear and entertaining explanation of SIP and also 3 activities that people can just take back and use in the classroom immediately. So thank you very much. And
My
thank you to
pleasure.
everyone for attending today's session. Penny's email was on the second slide, which you'll have access to afterwards. So if you do want to get in touch with her with any of your projects that you're doing on pronunciation or any comments, then I'm sure she'd love that too.
Yeah, sure. Okay. Thank you very much. Thanks everyone for watching.
Yep.
And yeah,
Okay.
happy to take any emails. Thanks, Sophie.
Okay. Thanks, everybody. Bye.
Bye.